Ever wondered what the Bible really says about sex? Get ready for surprising insights that might change how you view intimacy in marriage. Let's start with the basics. The Bible talks a lot about sex, but not always in the way you might think. God created sex as a gift for married couples. It's meant to be good, pleasurable, and unifying. Genesis 2:24 tells us, "Is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." This one flesh idea is at the heart of biblical teaching on sex. But what about specific acts? That's where things get interesting and often more complex. First up, oral sex. You won't find this term in the Bible, but we can look at related passages. In the Song of Solomon, there's poetic language that some interpret as references to oral sex between a married couple. For example, chapter 4, verse 16 says, "This imagery of tasting and fragrance could be seen as a celebration of oral intimacy." Similarly, in Song of Solomon 2.3, we read again, this could be interpreted as a reference to oral sex. However, it's important to note that these are interpretations, not direct statements. The Song of Solomon is a poetic book, full of metaphors and symbolism. While it certainly celebrates physical intimacy in marriage, we should be careful about reading too much into specific verses. The Bible doesn't give a clear yes or no on oral sex. Instead, it provides principles for sexual behavior in marriage. These include mutual consent, unselfishness, and avoiding anything harmful. 1 Corinthians 7:3-4 emphasizes mutual giving in sexual relationships. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now let's talk about anal sex. This topic is even more controversial in Christian circles. Unlike oral sex, there are no passages that could be interpreted as positive references to anal sex. Some point to Romans 1.27 as a condemnation of anal sex. But context is key. This passage is talking about same-sex relationships, not specific acts within marriage. It says, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. The Bible does warn against unnatural sexual acts, but it doesn't spell out what that means. Many Christian teachers argue that anal sex falls into this category because it doesn't align with the reproductive purpose of sex. They might point to the creation account in Genesis, where God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and increase in number, Genesis 1.28, as evidence that sex is primarily for procreation. Others say that if both spouses agree and no one is harmed, it's acceptable. They argue that the Bible's silence on the matter leaves room for personal discretion within marriage. The Bible doesn't give a direct answer. It's a matter of personal conviction and communication between married partners. Let's zoom out and look at sex in general. The Bible has a lot more to say here. In 1 Corinthians 7.5, Paul writes, this passage emphasizes several important points. Regular sexual intimacy is expected in marriage. Both spouses have a responsibility to meet each other's needs. Abstaining from sex should be a mutual decision, and only for short periods. Sexual intimacy helps protect against temptation. Hebrews 13.4 states, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. This verse underscores the importance of faithfulness and purity within marriage. But what does pure mean? That's where Christians often disagree. Some interpret it strictly, limiting sex to acts directly related to procreation. Others see it as allowing anything consensual between married partners. Key is to remember the overall biblical view of sex. It's designed for unity. As we saw in Genesis 2.24, a man and woman become one flesh in marriage. Sex is a physical expression of this spiritual and emotional unity. Pleasure. Proverbs 5.18.19 celebrates sexual enjoyment in marriage. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breasts satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Procreation. Genesis 1.28 commands couples to be fruitful and increase in number. While not every sexual act needs to be for procreation, this remains one of the purposes of sex: protection. As we saw in 1 Corinthians 7, regular sexual intimacy helps protect against temptation. When considering any sexual act, married couples should ask, does this bring us closer together? Is it mutually enjoyable? Could it cause physical or emotional harm? Are we both comfortable with it? Does it honor God and the purpose He designed for sex? Remember, the Bible's silence on specific acts doesn't equal approval. But it also doesn't automatically mean prohibition. It's about applying biblical principles with wisdom and love. Here's something to think about. Maybe the lack of specific rules is intentional. God gave us broad principles, trusting us to apply them wisely in our marriages. This requires open communication, mutual respect, and a desire to honor God in all aspects of life, including the bedroom. The Apostle Paul gives us a helpful principle in 1 Corinthians 10:23-24. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. While Paul wasn't specifically talking about sex here, the principle applies. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. We need to consider what's beneficial and constructive, not just for ourselves, but for our spouse and our marriage. Another important aspect to consider is the role of conscience. Romans 14:23 says, "But whoever has doubts is condemned if they eat, because their eating is not from faith, and everything that does not come from faith is sin." While this verse is about food, the principle can apply to sexual matters. If either spouse feels that a particular act is wrong, it's best to avoid it, even if it's not explicitly forbidden in Scripture. It's also worth noting that sexual desires and practices can become idolatrous if we're not careful. Colossians 3:5 warns, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." This doesn't mean all sexual desire is wrong, but it reminds us to keep sex in its proper place, as a gift from God, not a god itself. As we wrap up, consider this. The most important sexual organ is the mind. What we think about sex, how we approach it, and the attitudes we bring to intimacy matter more than any specific act. The Bible's teachings on sex are less about das and don ts, and more about cultivating a loving, selfless, God-honoring relationship.